And sorry for the wigged out looking Aristotle there, but actually, I thought it was just too good to pass up. But I don't think that's the way he looked. Although I guess maybe it's not so bad. As I promised, I'm going to start the Nichomachean ethics, and I'm going to focus in on friendship, but I do have to cover some of the rest of the book, particularly just focusing in on the virtues. And even today, I'm going to relate that. I'm going to continue to relate everything back to this issue of friendship, both friendship between people and then also citizen friendship. So let's get on into it. So, he starts off the ethics, and there is another ethics, the Eudemian ethics, but this is like a longer version of the other and a better one. So we stick pretty much with the Nichomachean ethics as a first stab anyway. He says at the very beginning that everything human beings do aims at some good, that this is just an axiomatic statement. But then the question is, what is the best good? What is it that we ultimately aim at? And he says it seems to concern the most controlling science, the one that more than any other is the ruling science. And I love this, right? Because it just so happens that it's my field. He says political science apparently has this character, for it is the one that prescribes which of the sciences ought to be studied in cities and which ones in each class in the city should learn, and so on. And he also says it uses the other sciences concerned with action and moreover legislates what must be done and what must be avoided. And so he goes on to basically prove the point, which I think is a very good point, that politics controls just about everything, ultimately, that people need to be happy. And that some of the other sciences, so-called sciences that exist that we think very highly of, such as the natural sciences, right? Engineering, chemistry, right? All the mechanical sciences, all of them are heavily impacted and controlled by the political order, just about everything. So I think that's an excellent point. So there's no way to extricate politics from happiness, unfortunately, I should say at this point, politics from what is good, but it all has to do with happiness. He says, in politics, we argue about what is fine and just. When you think about it, even though those are terms that you might not use in everyday parlance very much, what we're talking about most of the time in politics is what is just according to our perspective. We should aim at what is good generally when it comes to reasoning in this lecture. It was actually like a lecture that Aristotle gave, a series of lectures, most likely, right? And so he's saying, even though people argue about what is fine and just, and politics is full of arguments, we don't want to get into those finer points right now. We need to stick to the goal of figuring out what is generally good, okay? What people can agree upon. And people can agree that the good every action aims at ultimately is happiness, that what they really want is to be happy. They disagree about what will make them happy, and they even disagree about what happiness is, but it's universally true, he argues, that people ultimately aim at happiness, and everything else that they do, including every political argument they make or every political action they take, it is all aiming at making them happy. Maybe not everybody else happy. That's something we will get into later. But happiness is the goal of human action. All right, so if you can agree with that, then he moves on to, well, okay, let's think a little bit about what people say will make them happy, and see if we kind of narrow it down a little bit. All right. Is happiness pleasure? Is the life of pleasure happiness? Well, he dismisses this, saying that this is the life for a grazing animal. So I guess if you're a sheep or a cow, you might be happy with the life of simply eating whatever you want, drinking whatever you want, smoking whatever you want, engaging in physical activities that are pleasurable, and so on, and kind of keep it at that. It's the life of, ultimately, like if you take it to excess, it's the life of total debauchery. Now, you might get the impression from this that Aristotle is some sort of ascetic, right, who doesn't want people to experience pleasure. Far from the truth, right? Neither Plato nor Aristotle were like that. Actually, he's going to argue for moderation in this manner, but he's trying to make a strong point here that that definition is just bad because it doesn't aim at improving what is the highest part of the human being. Okay. The pleasures that we're talking about, we share with the animals. That's his point. Is it, making a lot of money? Surely a lot of people in our society would say that that's what would make us happy, because with money, we could get everything else, including all the things that bring physical pleasure, but we could also get political power and esteem and so on. Aristotle dodges it a little bit, but he basically says, well, we can dismiss this because money in and of itself does not make you happy. We make it and we try to get more of it because we think that the other things that we can buy with it will make us happy. Is happiness from living an honorable life in public, in politics? Is it being esteemed as honorable? Many people would say so, and they really strive for that, to be admired, to be considered, a fine, upstanding, admirable, even heroic, person by their peers. But he says, well, that's too superficial, because honor comes from others, and you can't always even control how others think of you. You can sure try. And if you seek for honor because it's external or superficial, you're constantly going to have to do what it takes to reinforce that, to get more of that, and worry about how other people see you. So it's not good enough either. Then he says that the aim of active people is virtue, which, being inner, is superior to honor. Okay. Active people, meaning people who use their mind and their body towards good actions, right? Which begs the question still, what is a good action? All right. But virtue as a goal, being an inner thing that is a quality of character, he says, is superior to honor because it doesn't come from other people and, superficial things that you can't control, but rather virtue is something within you that you can control and foster. And he's going to talk a lot about that. But he says it's still not good enough on its own, because a truly virtuous person can be unhappy, meaning that a person could be virtuous, but because of something else, which he will talk about more in a moment, he might still not be able to be happy. He brings in the life of the philosopher here as a final option, the life of study, of knowledge. And he says he's going to talk a lot more about that. That's the one that he's going to spend more time on. But as we're going to find out, even that in and of itself is not going to be quite enough. Okay. So if happiness is our goal, again, if we can agree on that, we should choose it as the highest good. It is good for its own sake. That's what makes it the highest good. Okay. You can do other things to obtain happiness. They're secondary. All right. Happiness is the goal. So he says, perhaps we shall find the best good if we first find the function of a human being. All right. So if we're talking about human happiness, we first need to know really what makes human beings human. All right. So on near the number 1097b, he says, well, perhaps we shall find the best good if we first find the function of a human being. For just as the good of doing well for a flutist, a sculptor, and every craftsman, and in general for whatever has a function and a characteristic action, seem to depend on its function, the same seems to be true for a human being, if a human being, as a human being, has some function. So the highest part of the human soul, which is particularly human, is reason. And he says that the excellent man reasons well and acts well, has virtue, and is happy. Unless, okay, so let's unpack this a bit. Reasons well and acts well, those two things go together. So it's not enough to be a contemplative, sort of like locked off from the world. One has to live a balanced life of reason and action. And the reasoning's no good if it's not put into action. And this lends itself to the citizen role, right? The citizen role, ideally someone who rules and is ruled in turn, who shares in governance somehow, as he says in the politics. All right. But unless is very important here. And here you see something about Aristotle that's really quite attractive. He understands that many people live in situations and conditions or accidents of nature or life happen to them that make it impossible for them to be happy, even if they are, even if they are excellent in their virtue, and even if they wish to act well. And part of the reason this is because literally you have to have certain means, such as physical health and ability, to act well. And you have to have even a certain amount of money to really take part in the social and political process in a meaningful way. All right. So he's very good about acknowledging this. And this brings in a whole dimension of realism and real understanding of the human situation that maybe you don't find so much in Plato. He says, nonetheless, happiness evidently also needs external goods to be added to the activity. As we said, since we cannot easily do fine actions if we lack the resources. For first of all, in many actions, we use friends, wealth, and political power, just as we use instruments. Further, deprivation of certain externals, like good birth, good children, beauty, mars our blessedness. For we do not altogether have the character of happiness if we look utterly repulsive, or are ill-born, solitary, or childless, and have it even less, presumably, if our children or friends are totally bad, or were good but have died. And so, as we have said, happiness would seem to need this sort of prosperity added also. That is why some people identify happiness with good fortune, while others identify it with virtue. So right there, he's just acknowledging the reality of our social lives, right? As social beings, there are certain things that, though it feels terribly unjust, because it's like an act of nature or God, right? That puts one in a less likely position to be able to enjoy full happiness. And we have to admit that as kind of like a first step in asking the question, what is likely to bring about true human happiness? So you can begin to see here how political science is essential to training citizens' minds, characters, and creating conditions that are conducive to the expression of virtue. Political science is essential because there has to be these conditions in place. Aristotle is saying, if you're too poor or probably if you're too rich, if you're not able to live a moderate life in pretty much every regard, if that's not possible economically, or because you're physically impaired somehow, or socially impaired, which, his reference to great physical ugliness, though it sounds terrible, is no doubt a fact. So, some of these things government can't do much about. Physical malformation or ugliness can't be done anything about. However, a lot of these things government can do something about, and particularly it can do something about helping people achieve the amount of material well-being needed to live a good life and to be able to have access to living a life of virtue. In the Politics, Aristotle discusses the need for a large middle class, something that really didn't exist at his time. He said you need that large middle class in order for people to feel grounded in their society, to feel as though they have a stake in it and want to pay attention to their citizen activities, to be able to engage in citizen virtue, in other words. So those two teachings go together quite well. And you can see even more, how government, politics, either plays a role in facilitating the development of human virtue or it does not. Now, on friendship, which is the focus of this series already, even though we haven't gotten to the chapter where the book where he deals with friendship, we can make some observations. Surely friendship cannot thrive in conditions in which human beings are not exercising their highest capacity of reason. So if you're in friendships where that isn't even a thing, right? They may be fun, but they aren't really going to be true friendships that aim at happiness. If the aim of friendship, like everything else, is happiness, unless it is exercising that highest capacity of reason, it is not going to make you happy. Now, does that mean that the only friendship is those amongst philosophers? No. He's talking about people developing deeper relationships where they understand each other's values, where they agree on those values, as we would call them today, the virtues, and they are able to discuss what's going on in their society and how they should relate to it. They're able to deliberate with each other and have actual conversations, okay? So this is what he's talking about. He teaches that the fullest friendship is therefore impeded either by friends that aren't interested in those things, but it's also impeded by conditions of deprivation and suffering. So friendship in its fullest and best form cannot be had under certain conditions where people are so deprived that they are thinking more about how to fix that immediate problem than they are in, forming relationships like that. Right? They can't afford to take the time to do that. Right? So people who are in those conditions, whether it's because of poverty or maybe some natural disaster or some disease that befalls them, they have to hope in those situations that they've already developed ties strong enough to others that they can obtain help, but they're not going to be able to carry on the fostering of those relationships because there's just not enough time, right? So a good society would try, again, to create the conditions with a minimum amount of deprivation and suffering in order for people to develop human relationships to their fullest and obtain the goal of happiness. The best friendship, from this point of view, then, would support the growth of all involved towards virtue. Aristotle recognizes that there has to be a certain cushion in society, right? A person has to have a certain number of material goods and physical goods in order to really engage in that. And that could be taken to say, oh, well, then many people can't. But then if you remember what he says in the politics about the goodness of a middle class, you see that he is beginning to think in terms of the material well-being, welfare of the large middle, the large number of people. And to the extent possible, shrinking those who are very, very poor and balancing the ever-present uber rich with the many who would have enough property. So interestingly, this teaching does get tied up with the idea of economic class. Now, he talks a little bit about how habituation is important too, right? Like fine reason, he says, leads to virtue of thought. It could make you a good philosopher, but virtues of character are obtained by both good reason and habituation. There he differs from Plato in thinking that it does take like training and habit, and actually, in a way, like faking it until you make it. And this is why training children is very important. But throughout our lives, he would say, we have to simply do what is considered by us to be virtuous and good in our actions towards the external world. And then that will help us form our character. Character formation, he says, must be active for people to become good. Okay. It has to be an ongoing process. And again, we can see the role of government here in creating good laws that aid character formation, as well as, of course, providing good education. Now, again, people in our society, of course, argue tremendously about what good character even is. And therefore, the liberal solution is to basically hive off character formation into the private life and say, it's the character formation is the job of the family or of the church or synagogue or mosque or, any religious body. It's your private choice, but it's not something that the government ought to be involved in. Aristotle is just not, he doesn't go there at all. Okay. Good laws are all about character formation. That's what government is for. And he's going to define the person of virtue very clearly in this book. And he's going to define what makes for proper friendship, and government ought to foster that, including the best public friendship, citizen friendship. All right. So a little bit more on habituation here. I just wanted to read this to you because it's pretty good. All right. So he says, the agent must also be in the right state when he does these things. First, he must know that he is doing virtuous actions. Second, he must decide on them and decide on them for themselves. So he has to consent. I'm going to take this hike because I believe that, perseverance is a virtue. I'm doing the hike for the sake of developing that virtue. And he says, third, he must also do them from a firm and unchanging state. I resolve it. As conditions for having a craft, these three do not count except for the knowing itself. As a condition for having virtue, however, the knowing counts for nothing, or rather only for a little, whereas the other two conditions are very important, indeed all important. And other two conditions are achieved by the frequent doing of just and temperate actions. So he's placing the emphasis there on doing. And that's what habituation is all about. So if anybody listening is wondering, how do I sort of elevate myself and how do I achieve a better life in that regard, and also better friends and friendship? It would be by simply, Aristotle would say, simply by going and doing those things that you already know are more virtuous, right? Things that are admirable, that things that represent what you would like to become. If you want to be somebody who has perseverance, right, and fortitude, and you currently lack that, then take the hikes and hike with others who have similar goals. And in the process, you make friendships around the similar goal and the admiration for that virtue. Now, people generally don't talk this way, but nevertheless, maybe we should. If you are together with others for the cultivation of a particular virtue in your soul, then you've got common ground. You can have conversations, and they're going to be the kind of conversations that Aristotle would say lead to actual good friendship and not just, mutual pleasure, or domination or something like that. Okay. Finally, I'll just leave you with this thought, and I'll be getting into this more next time. Virtue, he explains, is a type of moderation, or is expressed through moderation. Virtue is, he defines it as the mean between two extremes. And I'll just read you this just as an example, and then we'll get into it more next time. He says, first, then, we should observe that these sorts of states naturally tend to be ruined by excess and deficiency. We see this happen with strength and health, which we mention because we first use that as evident as a witness to what is not. For both excessive and deficient exercises ruin strength. And likewise, too much or too little eating or drinking ruins health, while the proportionate amount produces, increases, and preserves it. The same is true then of temperance, which is moderation, temperance, bravery, and the other virtues. For if someone avoids and is afraid of everything standing firm against nothing, he becomes cowardly. But if he is afraid of nothing at all, he becomes rash. So in that case, courage is the mean between cowardice and rashness, which is basically foolhardiness. Okay. So that's just to give you a taste of his way of thinking as he begins to define the virtues. And we'll continue to talk about friendship through this process, right, of going through these virtues. Friendship is best fostered among people who share the goal of obtaining virtues, because they have this very central internal thing in common, and they can then have conversations and they can grow in trust and bonds with something real, something that they know they agree on, which is much more firm than many of the other things that lead people to congregate together.